I watched a movie called The Woman in the Yard. I was convinced that this was the lowest we could possibly sink for horror films by the title alone. But it's a Blumhouse film, which means it's going to make money no matter what. And I went yesterday, and it was a sold-out theater, basically. I had to sit in the front row. Do you understand how mad I was? I was sitting there steaming. I have had no problems for any release over the last 6 months, no matter how big. Yet somehow the fucking Woman in the Yard at 10:30 p.m., I can't get out of the front row loony bin. I'm just sitting there breaking my neck staring straight up at it like I'm trying to catch a fucking golden shower with my mouth open. For The Woman in the Yard, I was livid. My eggs were scrambled. I sat there with my arms crossed pouting by the time the movie started. Which, it's not the movie's fault. I mean, good for The Woman in the Yard. It's putting asses in seats somehow. That shit is selling tons and tons. I bet it's gonna make a fucking fortune off of like a like $12 million budget or something, I imagine. Because Blumhouse, all they do is like really low budget horror films, so everything is a profit. I've said that is the smartest model, and I don't know why more Hollywood studios don't follow that model. They only ever make money. No matter how catastrophic or how boring, lazy, or generic it is, you make a low-budget horror film, you're going 3x on your budget plus marketing. So I have no doubt The Woman in the Yard is going to follow suit, especially considering the turnout I saw for it yesterday, which I am still stunned by. This had more movement than the Halo 3 midnight launch. I don't know what people are seeing in the trailer for The Woman in the Yard that makes them think it's going to be good. It's not. I thought at best it would be fun bad. It's not. It's just boring. It's not even bad, per se. It's not like a horrible film. It's not terrible, but it's not good. So it doesn't get to have the luxury of being enjoyably stinky. It just is mediocre, which I think is the ultimate sin. Because again, you can be bad and charming and memorable and enjoyable, or you can just be good. But if you're neither, you go right down in purgatory and you're forgettable and boring, and I feel like I wasted my time watching it. I want to give you my review, though. As the title would indicate, there is a woman in the yard, almost immediately. They name drop the title within the first, 10 minutes. So, the story is about a family that's going through a loss. The mother and father were in a car accident which claimed the life of the husband. However, the mother survived and is overcome with a lot of trauma, and the family still is, of course, feeling the loss of the father. It's only been a couple of weeks since that accident, and when they were downstairs eating, one of the kids, named Taylor, said, "Hey, Mom, there's a woman in the yard." So the mother goes and checks, and sure enough, there's a fucking woman in the yard. So, as you've seen in the trailer, it's a woman sitting in a chair in the yard. So, the title did not lie. It is not false advertising. You get what you pay for right away. You get a woman in the yard, and she is posting up. She is slabbed up in the middle of the yard, and it's odd because she's dressed like it's like morning attire. It's very weird and concerning. So the mother goes and checks, and of course the mother is going through a rough time, and she's taking all of her anger and frustration out on her kids. She is miserable. And she goes out. She still has an injured leg from the car accident, so she's on crutches, and she goes out. So she says, "Hey, why are you sitting in the yard, lady?" And this leads to a short and odd conversation between the two of them, with the woman in the yard eventually revealing some blood in her hands. And that's when the mom goes, "Jeepers, this is a threat now. This woman in the yard is dangerous," so she goes back inside, locks all the doors, and it turns out her chickens have been slaughtered by the woman in the yard. So, do you care about spoilers? My guess is probably not. I'm going to get into spoilers so I can tell you why I think the movie's pretty fucking boring. So you have been warned. I'm going to get into spoilers for The Woman in the Yard. But before I do that, I will say there are a couple of things I actually think are pretty solid about the film. There are some really good shots, and I do mean that. There are some actually good shots in here that I did not expect from The Woman in the Yard. They had really cool shots, especially when it came to a certain sequence that involved glass, and the powers of the woman in the yard, I think, look cool and are at least something different than you usually see in horror films, and got pretty creative with it. I also think the acting was good, particularly from the mother. So, it's all the good stuff out of the way. Now, into the spoilers. This movie is the epitome of that SpongeBob meme. He's just standing there menacingly. That is the whole film. There is nothing that happens outside of the family bickering. The mother is terrible to her kids. She is going through some horrible things, and she is taking it out on her family. The entire, I'd say 70% of the film is focused on her being mean to her kids and one of her kids, Taylor, kind of talking back and being like, Mom, you know, you're not acting like yourself. And the mom's like throwing glass on the floor, even throws something at her kids. And then that's like the bulk of the film. Meanwhile, they'll just keep looking out the window and noticing the woman in the yard is getting closer. So that's it. There's not really scares. There's just occasional loud noises, but no scares. Eventually, as the woman in the yard gets closer, the kid, Taylor, decides to take matters into his own hands because his mother is completely incapable of protecting them at all. She has, like, no survival instincts. So, like, the power has been off all day, so they haven't been able to, like, call for help. The mother's phone is not charged, so they also can't call for help there. The Jeep battery is dead, so they can't go and, like, scram and get out of there. But Taylor is constantly coming up with other solutions. Like, okay, so the power's not working, we can't call for help. Well, what if we just start running to the neighbors to call for help to get this woman in the yard out of here because she's scaring us? And she's like, no, you can't do that. And it's like, well, why the fuck not? She's just sitting in the yard. We've established she's not going anywhere. This kid could easily run to the neighbors, which he says he can do. He even said I could drive the car there. She's like, no, you don't drive the car. And it turns out the car's dead. But, like, he's the only one offering solutions. He's like, okay, I'm going to get Dad's gun and I'll shoot her. And she's like, no, you will not do that. And it's like, what the fuck? He's the only one with any sense in the whole film. Now, of course, I think that's the point, because, big spoiler here, the whole film is about the mother and what she's gone through with the trauma after losing her husband in a car accident that she feels she is responsible for. That's the big twist. So the woman in the yard mentioned during their conversation she had been summoned by the mother. The mother's confused on what it meant. And then we get to the last half of this film. So now we see the woman in the yard. She's standing up from her chair. Now she's using her powers, and her powers are shadow manipulation. And there's some cool shots with this, where she has, like, her arm as a shadow reaching up and she hits a wind chime for a scare. Or she's using her shadows in the house to pick up things and throw them around, which I think is the most cliche shit ever. I am so tired of that fucking horror movie trope where things just move around like, ooh, spooky, moving fucking plates and shit. But at least using the shadow powers to do it was cool looking. It really reminded me of Courage the Cowardly Dog with that episode where, like, the shadows fight each other. I love that. I love Courage the Cowardly Dog, and I can always find ways of tying it into movies I watch because Courage just had so much good shit to it. So it did remind me of that. But the shadows were a cool idea, and there was some creativity there where they started closing blinds in order to take away shadows so she couldn't use it. Like, it was good ideas that really feel worthless in a movie like this, unfortunately. So anyway, after she starts demonstrating her powers and they start countering it by getting rid of the shadows, it then goes into, like, a totally separate movie after they end up in the attic. After they've run away from the shadows and they're up in the attic. Where it just becomes a fucking totally different movie. It gets so trippy and surreal. It has, like, time-altering elements where the mother, like, she starts going to, like, the past where her husband is there, and we get to, like, see that, and it's like a happily ever after thing, but it turns out it's like the mirror dimension, so everything's like flipped. Then she comes back to reality, but now she's the woman in the yard, so she's sitting in the chair. So now we're seeing the movie play out in front of her as the woman in the chair from her perspective. Like, these are cool ideas and they look cool, but it doesn't fit with the rest of the film that's just been established. It just comes out of nowhere. Like, it seems like what happened is they had the woman in the yard and they wanted it to be like this really formulaic, throwaway, dog shit horror film. And then the director's like, this sucks. I really want to try something. They're like, okay, as long as we just get some tickets, some asses and seats, just put it to the end of the movie. Who cares? So he decided to get experimental. And I appreciate what he tried to do, but I just don't think it works for the movie. What ends up happening is the woman in the yard is there because the mother wants to end her own life. She's going through so much grief and she feels like her kids are going to be so much better off without her. So the woman in the yard is there to help her do that. And that's where you get to the ending of the film where she has like a gun to her head and the woman in the yard's like helping her pull the trigger to end her own life. And then she doesn't. She walks away, her kids come back, and it's happily ever after. But then it turns to one of the pictures and her name, Ramona, is backwards. Thus, the implication is she did take her own life and now she's in the mirror dimension of the happily ever after that's not real. It's a very bleak ending and it takes a lot of fucking balls to do that. So ultimately the message of the movie is she couldn't move on from her grief, thought her kids would be better off without her, so she shoots herself in the head. It's a pretty crazy message to send, really. And I can at least appreciate it tried to do something at the end here, but it takes the last 15 minutes and just crams so much shit all at once. Tons of different ideas, different imagery, all overloading you in like 10 minutes. It just doesn't mesh with the rest of the movie. So overall, Woman in the Yard is not a good movie, but it's also not a terrible film either. I really think it's just a boring film at the end of the day. That had some good ideas, it had some clever moments, it had some good acting, but it didn't really do anything. And it's hardly even a horror film in the first place. So yeah, overall, not a great movie. I just wanted to give you the little review on it. That's about it. There's a lot you could say about this film, but one thing that you can never criticize it for is that it lied to you. There was a fucking woman in that yard for over an hour doing nothing. That's pretty cool. That's about it. See ya.